Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm delighted that it's the Holy Trinity. It's the three of us back again, Markus Vincent and Mark Bilby. Before we kick off and I hand over to Mark to introduce our topic for today's discussion, I just want to remind you all it's so important for the growth of the channel and also to support us that you subscribe just down below and like and comment on our videos. And indeed, if you can, please do share them. I didn't realize how important this is for a YouTube channel until we started our own. We would be so grateful if you could do that. And so without further ado, Mark, what have you got for us today?
Right. One of the things that our team has been working on now for a few years really is, when restoring Marcion's gospel, how do we deal with different kinds of material? So we have the church fathers in some cases that clearly attest to material where we would say it's attested as present, and you can restore from there using comparisons and all these sorts of things. And then we have material that's attested as absent, which is very important too as a category, because once you mine that data, you start to see patterns that are very distinctive from the present material. But then we have this third category or bucket or label of unattested. And that's something that scholars really haven't known what to do with. I think in a lot of ways, it's been a gray area. And our team is really trying to apply data science methods for the first time to sort through this gray material and figure out what is present and what is not present. We've heard other scholars that work on Marcion kind of throw shade our direction and say, we don't really believe that there's any such thing as unattested material. And that's just a false statement or just lacking nuance or sophistication. I like the Yoda expression, there is no try, do or do not. And when it comes to Marcion's text, ultimately we need to make those decisions if we're about the business of scientific restoration. I like to think of it as sort of different points of beginning. So if you're starting from the church fathers, the patristic authors as a source, then of course there's unattested material. We have present, where it corresponds perfectly to Luke or canonical Paul. We have absent, things missing from those texts. But then we have unattested, where it's material that's in the canonical text that the church fathers don't give us any indication about one way or another, at least the wording in that specific context.
May I
but
just add
But if I could just finish the point real quick, but if you look at it from the perspective of Marcion's texts themselves, then there is no such thing as unattested. There was only material in present or not present. And we have to then sort of divide the unattested material. But even then, and maybe Marcus, you'll get into this more, is often what is taken to be unattested is actually attested just in phrases in other places. If you can find an exact word parallel between an attested passage over here and then what the canonical text says in an unattested passage, it's almost like a puzzle piece where you might be able to fit those words in. But it's a much more sophisticated process, really, of identification of vocal signals and then decontamination of canonical signals. But Marcus, please fill us in.
Yeah, I just want to frame it a little bit for our viewers, because we had last time we had a very critical question in the comments, and I thought that was very important as a critical question, where the people were asking and saying, well, are we not overstating our case anyway? So even with regards to the so-called attested verses, I mean, how can we make up any text if we haven't got A, manuscript, B, if we have only the church fathers, and we have only church fathers who are the opponents even of Marcion. So I think the question is put the right way. So what allows us to move from, let's say, before we go to the unattested, which are the most, as you say, gray area, the most complicated thing. So how can we even start taking the witnesses, even if they are opponents, yeah? How can we get from there to a text? And I think we have to reflect about, and this comes back to what you are saying, Mark, about the approach we take, yeah? If we have the old approach of Hilgenfeld, Zahn, of Harnack, and of Schmidt and Roth, and God knows who else, yeah, who all think with Irenaeus and Tertullian and Epiphanius, with the church fathers. Yeah. So if we go with the church fathers and believe that Marcion is an abbreviator of a canonical text, then, and only then, we have no manuscript. We have only opponents who witness for Marcion's text and nothing else. And we are on a weak, one has to admit, on a weak foundation. Now, the question, however, is the same people who accuse us of relying on the church fathers rely on the church fathers, because that's the approach I've just outlined from the past to the present. So we can't have it both ways. Either we mistrust the church fathers or we trust them. If we trust them, we also have to trust if they are giving us text of the opponent. Or we dismiss them all over the place, and then we don't need to do scholarship anyway. So I think what we have to do is, if we go with the old approach, and accept that church fathers have some bearing, then we need to see what kind of a bearing they have. Now, if for a number of reasons, I think, we can search through these church fathers and we can distinguish between what they do attest and what they don't, then we can make a judgment. And I think that the case today, and we have a very good case because we're going into Luke 4 and we'll make some comparisons and we'll see to what extent are these church fathers and in which way they are reliable or unreliable. And the last word before we then start is, if all in the past and still also the critiques today trust the church fathers, we can also trust the church fathers with regards to saying they have read a text which they credit to Marcion, both with regards to gospel and the 10 letters of Paul. They don't credit both texts to anybody else. Second, they are unanimous in saying that these texts that are credited to Marcion only deviate in certain aspects from the canonical text. So what they are doing is, in Tertullian as well as in Epiphanius, two different people, different languages even. But what they're doing is they are showing that we can compare the text that they read as they have done, namely they have compared these texts to canonical texts. With regards to gospel, Tertullian says that Marcion's gospel deviates only particularly from the text from Luke. Where he doesn't deviate, he represents the canonical text. So the canonical text is the point of reference. And exactly the same in Epiphanius, and that applies not only to the gospel, but also to the 10 Pauline letters. And that means we have a reason for having a witness. And it's the logic in Tertullian and it's the logic in Epiphanius that the first witness for Marcion's texts are the canonical texts. Although at the same time they are saying Marcion is an abbreviator. But whichever way you turn it, both think from the perspective of Marcion being the baseline and the canonical text being the reference, as if all manuscripts of the canonical texts are witnessing Marcion's text, but in a different form. So that's the frame, and let's move from there.
Yeah, and I think it's also important here to note that the history of scholarship here, even the most minimalist, so scholars like Tsutsui or Roth or Harnack, who only restore about 4,000 words, for instance, for the Evangelion, they would not dispute at all that Marcion's text correlates significantly to the canonical text, that it is a text that we can know at least something about. Maybe we can only know half of its content, and maybe a lot of it's dubious, but they don't doubt the entire project. So a radical skepticism that says we can't know anything about this text, that's just out of bounds really in terms of what any scholars are doing. No respectable scholar has taken that position or tried to defend that position in any peer-reviewed piece of literature that I know. So if naysayers want to take that position, that's fine, but publish it, demonstrate that as an argument. But that's just not, there's a wide range of scholarship from, Klinghardt on one side to Roth on the other side, and nobody's taking that position. So it's just not a serious position to take that we can, casting absolute doubt. That really is just, to me, canonical prejudice, dismissing a heretical text. It really just is like a fideistic point of view, saying we can't know anything about that, as if the canonical texts themselves were not a matter of reconstruction. And by the way, patristic citations are used all the time in the reconstruction of canonical texts, right? Yeah, scholars like Bart Ehrman, he wrote his dissertation on Didymus of Alexandria and all of his citations to the canonical text as important for text criticism. So the scriptures do not come to us just through manuscripts of the scriptures. They come to us through lectionaries, they come to us through commentaries, they come to us through liturgies, right? You can't contain these signals. These signals are exploding and traveling in all kinds of directions. So the wise scholar understands that data is coming to us in all these different directions, and we have to be open to finding those traces, those signals, however they come to us. I guess I can continue on. Maybe I can share my screen now, and we can get to the exercise. So this is one where I would push back on scholars like Roth, and I think Litwa is here as well, to say, we can't really know. A lot of this stuff would just be considered unattested. So this is Luke 4:16 through 30. This is famously known as the Nazareth pericope in canonical Luke. This is Jesus's first sermon. It's a famous episode. He gets up, he preaches, makes reference to Isaiah, makes reference to the Hebrew holiday of Jubilees, makes reference to Elijah, and then offends the people so badly that they try to throw him off of a cliff, and then he somehow escapes through their midst. So it's a very famous story. This opening of the ministry of Jesus's ministry in canonical Luke. But where scholars like Roth would say a lot of this stuff, and Harnack would say a lot of this stuff is just unattested and we can't really know anything about it. The other approach, where you start from the Marcionite text, is the earlier text. It shows to me a very coherent text. And this is one where I think evidence has just been ignored in terms of particularly sequencing, right? I'm thinking of here the importance of sequence matches for data analyses like logistic regression, right? So when we look at the attested passages, we get multiple independent attestations of key elements of this story. And when you string them together, it actually presents a coherent, though brief, narrative. And that is that Jesus came to Nazareth. So we've basically outlined this in bold and underline. Jesus came to Nazareth. Tertullian agrees on that. Jerome agrees on that. So we have independent witnesses, in that case, both in Latin, though Ephraim in Syriac does attest to the verb came in this context as well. So we do have a third independent and other language reference. And then Luke 23, that Jesus said something to them and that it was a proverb. We get that in Tertullian. We get that confirmed in Ephraim as well. And that it was probably physician, heal yourself. We get that directly in Ephraim. And most scholars, even scholars who are experts just on Tertullian and reconstructing his against Marcion in the Source Chrétien edition, for instance, think that physician, heal yourself was what was in mind here. And then we have Luke 4:27, though it's not attested here. It is attested in full, but it's here in canonical Luke, but it's not part of the sequence of Marcion's text. Again, not something that is necessary to the text here, though one can understand why the canonical redactor might have fit it back in here as a way of framing the whole ministry of Jesus as something that was offensive to his own people and opening up the ministry to the Gentiles, as it were. And then we have Luke 4:29, where the people rise up, they grab Jesus and they try to throw him out of the city, and then they lead him to the cliff of a mountain or the brow of a mountain and try to throw him down, and then how he escapes through. So when we start to look, and we'll come back to this, but when we start to look at the witnesses, So here I have Tertullian real quick, and I hope everybody can see this. We're trying to make these things bigger so that they're more visible on a smaller screen. But we see Tertullian here attesting to Nazareth right here. We see the mention of the one proverb, that's Luke 4:23. We have the hands laid on him, that's Luke 4:29. We have the cliff, Luke 4:29. And then Jesus escaping through their midst, Luke 4:30. So brief key elements. When we go to Ephraim in Syriac, he basically gives us the same elements. Something like, that sounds a little bit like Luke 4:16, something that might fit in other parts of the passage, but Luke 4:16 works here as well. The physician heal yourself saying, 4:23, driving to a cliff, 4:29, trying to cast him off, 4:29, and 4:30 is not mentioned, but this is Ephraim's commentary on the Diatessaron. And the Diatessaron is its own huge, complicated topic that we won't get into today, but there are ways that the Diatessaron might correlate to Marcion's text against the canonical text. And in the East, especially, Marcion's gospel was much more popular. So it looks like Ephraim is working here, and he explicitly mentions Marcion in other contexts. And then if we look at Jerome in a completely separate context that does not seem to be dependent at all on Tertullian, writing a century and a half after Tertullian, he specifically again mentions the elements of Nazareth, and then Jesus being thrown down from the mountain, and then Jesus escaping through their hands. So we have these repeatedly, consistently, multiply attested in multiple language elements that cross language, that cross centuries, and that they all align on. And then when scholars like Markus and I look at the other elements in this text, what we see is a lot of typical canonical redactional features. So extended Septuagintal references, for instance, dramatization, literate protagonists.
I would suggest, Mark, we do exactly for the audience what we usually do when we work. Yeah.
Okay.
So we look at the stuff which is typically which is not attested. The stuff which is attested we have here. Although I might ask you again, verse 27 has never been mentioned by one of the three chaps that you have just shown.
In this context.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I would be skeptical about 27 at the moment, yeah, as a scholar, because if three people jump from 16 to 23 to 29, I think the indication would be first, those are the most reliable elements which we should not take out.
Yeah.
Which we suppose were in the text.
Exactly.
Now, and probably now could do what you and me normally do. We look at typical features which are never, ever either in the attested texts in the gospel or in the 10-letter collection of Paul. I give you one example, biblion, yeah, which is here translated as, where is it in verse 17?
Just book, but little book is really a better translation of biblion, isn't it?
Yeah, but both biblos and biblion, the small book, never ever appears. Maybe you mark it with red.
I can can I do italics?
Or
Just
italics,
because
yeah.
we're dealing with black and white. Yeah.
So this is the first clear indicator that we have to do with a canonical redactional element.
Yeah.
And maybe we find, biblion is in the same verse again.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're twice.
We also have words here. You don't really get it in English, but the opened and closed, technically it's unrolled and rolled. These are synagogue terms about using a scroll, and they also happen to be hapax legomena, right? These terms don't occur anywhere in the New Testament, only here. And what you find generally is the Marcionite text doesn't have very many hapax legomena. The canonical texts are full of hapax legomena.
Then we have in verse 20 biblion again.
Yep.
So it's a really important word in the canonical text, but completely absent from the Marcionite texts, both the Gospel and Then we have in 21, hegraphe, another, the writing, another,
the scripture,
typically,
the writing. Yep. Verbs of fulfillments, pleiraomai is there just after that. All the fulfillment verbs are in the canonical text, and they're never in the Marcionite text. That's pleirao and pimplemi.
So the audience can see what we've got is that those verses which 3 witnesses do not mention to be present are filled with words that we find only in the canonical New Testament. So we have from 2 sides, we have the confirmation. A, those verses are not mentioned for Marcion, and B, the material that we find in these verses are never in the material of Marcion. And hence, this is material which is canonical. And what I would do is I would delete those verses where we have these elements of the canonical version.
Right. We could just do that. This is essentially our process. This is the decontamination process.
Yeah.
And
you can see it's a logical text that remains. And he came to Nazareth and he said to them, no doubt you will quote, maybe that might be a reductional revision, but certainly this were proverb, whether to me or not.
Right. It doesn't seem to be inviting.
Is in doubt, yeah. Let's wait for 27. But if 27 had not been there, we would read, and he came to Nazareth and he said to them this proverb, physician, heal yourself. And they rose up and cast him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill to throw him down. And he went his way.
Yeah.
And you can see
even on their city had been built. We have these building architectural references all over the place as well in the canonical text, and references to city. That also is a typical canonical redactional feature.
And so you can see how the reconstruction works. That's exactly how we reconstruct. And you can see at the end you have a fully workable text. And he came to Nazareth. He said to them this proverb, physician, heal yourself. They rose up and cast him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill to throw him down the cliff. But through their midst, he went his way. And I guess this is the basis of the canonical text on which the canonical redactors have worked, have broadened it, have brought in historical or architectural material or Septuagintal material. And that's how we move from a text, a small text, to a pericope. Now, the other way around, if we were wrong and if Tertullian were right, that the redactor, be it Marcion or somebody else, but he says it's Marcion, if he had cut down the canonical text to this text here, we could not explain why is this Marcion obsessed by removing architectural material. Why is he obsessed with removing references or even more textual references? I mean, language references, to the Septuagint. And we're not talking about verses or quotes. We're talking about material, like a book or booklet. Why would you remove that? There's no point.
Let me ask the question that I can imagine a viewer at home might be saying right now. Why add the scroll in? Why add the book in? Why add the city in?
Oh,
that's the question. That's the question I think might be asked.
That's easy to explain. If you want Jesus to read a passage in the synagogue, then you reference first Josiah. And then you need the scroll from which he reads. And it is a book's process. And that's all you have. And then you need to also locate him somewhere. So you need all that stuff which is canonical. Hence, there is an explanation for the addition, but there's no explanation for the cutting down or the withdrawing of this material.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like a lottery where if you look at all the words in this text, right, a couple hundred words, something like that, what are the odds, right? This would be a fun thing to run a statistical analysis on. What are the odds that you have 3 different witnesses who happen to attest to the same words out of those 200 words, and that they don't attest, and they do so in a reasonable sequence. I suppose you could say they're just, as a counter argument, they're just abridging, they're just summarizing, and they're summarizing the most memorable scenes or words in the text. But that's quite a subjective claim to make, because there's a lot of material that's quite memorable, that's quite emphatic, about widows at Zarephath, Elijah references, Jubilee references, synagogue liturgy, people's rage. There's emotion that's in the canonical text that's not in the Marcionite text. So to me, it just doesn't hold any water going the other way to say that, they just all happen to condense in the exact same way, independently across centuries, across languages. So, to me, this is one of those cases. And if you look at the, Roth's text, for instance, you'll just see that he indicates all these verses as unattested, possibly not present, or just unattested, and that's it. Because, essentially, to me, it's lacking the scholarly courage or just the awareness of data patterns to take that next step and say, nope, this wasn't present. All the other patterns show us, this clear divergence. We have patterns of clear attestation that give us these verses that we're looking at right now. And then we have patterns of absence that verify all the other elements that we've been pulling out, essentially, of this reconstruction. So, but what we just did here live, this is essentially what I've done in my book, already. And this is also, Marcus, you made this point before too, about all the different reconstructions. If you put Roth and Niccolodi and Klinghart and Badun all side by side, and you look at the common elements, what will you get? This. The
Exactly.
thing that we just reconstructed here on the fly are, the elements that every scholar who's looked at this text agrees on. The only differences are other things. And, again, those other things make sense as part of a redactional program, like as was his custom, or the place he grew up, right? If you're writing canonical Luke with a story of the childhood of Jesus, then you want to reinforce the place that he grew up.
Like in 24, which actually Klinghart has taken into his reconstruction, but only in normal script, which means potentially there, potentially not there.
Yeah.
But 24 starts with Amen lego humin. So amen, I say to you, a very emphatic statement. But amen never appears in the Marcionite texts, never in the attested parts. Only once where amen is in as a noun, to amen, but never as an emphatic element. And though these emphatic elements are markers of the canonical tradition. And that's why I think in our reconstruction 24 would not feature, but not because we don't like the verse, simply because it goes against the semantic use.
Exactly. And if I can take a step back too, a lot of this stuff, because we're dealing with texts that have been used for devotional purposes for years, right? There's reverence and sacredness that attends these texts, and they've been performed and they're so well known, and in some ways it almost feels irreverent to tear them apart like this. I could see how for a lot of people coming from a faith perspective, what we've just done here just feels like a violation of the scriptures. But what we see ourselves doing is not anti-religious at all. Well, I think we see, and of course you both can speak for yourselves, but what I see this as is really uncovering the origins. It's uncovering an earlier stage in the development of these texts. If we think about Christianity as something that took time to grow, like all social movements, like all living things, it took time to grow, then this is its early stage. This is what we've reconstructed here is kind of the infancy or the childhood of the Christian movement. It lacks a childhood of Jesus, but if you really want to get back to like the very earliest layers that we can find in the Christian movement, and it's not this does not demean Jesus at all. It just says that he quoted something. To me, it sounds a little bit like an Aesopian proverb, and that people tried to kill him, which is what people did to Aesop. So Jesus, and the rabbis loved Aesop, by the way. So that Jesus would be a storyteller and a fable teller like Aesop, and that he might get killed like Aesop, thrown off of a cliff. That's not weird. That's very typical within Jewish tradition. Like read about the Tanaim, the rabbis of the early 2nd century, and their love of Aesop. They would tell like fox fables all day long. They had 300 of them memorized, right? So, Aesop references in this early stratum, to me, it's not irreverent at all. It's showing probably also too like a lower class social place from which this literature came. It wasn't at first highfalutin literature. It became much more sophisticated over time as Jesus was made into more like a member of the intelligentsia, you might say. But the earliest layer, Jesus is much more sort of a person of the people, that at least as I see him as depicted in this text.
Yeah, and if I might talk to that as well, I mean, I get castigated as the heretic by Christians and the cognitive dissonance monster by the secular for my position that I hold as both someone who holds to the faith and dissects these texts like you do. And I agree with you that I don't see it at all as a destruction or a diminishing of any Christian doctrine. At the end of the day, the process of canonization, which we've talked about on this channel, is one that is not quite, I think, as most Christians would perceive it. And so when you realize that's the case, then you can separate the idea of this is a canonized text, but also this is the scholarship and the rigor that one needs to go through to dissect a text such as Luke from Marcion. And what we're doing is only a pursuit of the historical, and people might use it as an attack against the religious, but that's not our aim and is not the purpose of what we're doing. And indeed, Mark, I actually quite like what you just said, is that we are only like through several layers of earth digging through, let's say, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Stone Age, and it's not that the Iron Age is any worse than the Bronze Age or the Stone Age, but rather they are different levels of society, and so too we're just tracing back earlier strata of what's going on. Is the way I perceive it.
Which also brings us back to another comment that we got last week about are you a believer? It was addressed to me, but so I picked up. Are you a believer or an atheist? And I think we should have on this channel quite soon a session where we discuss that. I mean, this is part of the question you just raised, Jack and Mark. And I'm happy to talk about me, and I'm sure the three of us will have three different views. Fortunately, I mean that's why we are together. We hardly agree. I mean, except for a reduction of a text to what we can make sense of, right? But that's nature. I mean, human nature, and I think it would be worth having to take those questions and comments serious, which we do. I read all of your comments, and I don't have to say something to everything because I don't know everything. But I'm happy to pick up those questions and address them.
Yeah, and in some sense, I agree. I promise you, viewers, we will schedule that episode maybe in a live so that you can get us in person and ask us questions in as if we were in the living room. But I also think that to some extent, our religious perspectives are entirely irrelevant to the scholarly credentials that we have. And so one of the things I found absolutely hilarious was on one of the other channels, History Valley, I gave a series of lectures on Ignatius and Marcion. Someone found out I was a Latin Macedonian Catholic and then said everything he says is untrue because he's Catholic. And it's like, how is that relevant to Ignatius of Antioch scholarship? Like, that has no bearing on anything I'm saying. And so, although we should address it, and I think it's good that we do, please judge us on the merits of our arguments. And if you find some great argument that indeed Tertullian is right and Luke it was redacted by Marcion into his gospel, we would love to see it. Please come and show us. But until then, engage with us on those terms and try and be civil, right? That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's, I'm a fan. I'm not part of the Roman Catholic Church myself, but there's the Catholic, Vatican II emphasis on going back to the sources and then constant renewal. And to me, this is an exercise in both. This is, trying to get back to the sources of whatever they were of the tradition, but this is also a way to re-tradition, right? Like thinking anew and afresh. about what this movement was. And maybe it wasn't that the scriptures just came into existence in a flash in the first century, and then the church just took off from there. Maybe it was a gradual process, and maybe Christianity really only came into its own as a religion during and after the Bar Kokhba revolts, right? And was much more of like a messianic movement, maybe prior to that, you know, just a Jewish messianic movement. So just seeing where we come from, and you know, and questioning those things, and seeing the theological assumptions. You know, the assumption that the scriptures are first century texts, that can be a Protestant assumption, but it can also be a Catholic or early Orthodox assumption that says there has to be absolute continuity and absolute apostolic authorship. Well, but if you take those as your starting frameworks, you'll never be open to, you know, what the underlying realities might be.
And indeed, shout out to our previous video on the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was great when Marcus and I discussed that. And just to add to that further, the sacred nature, Mark, that you talked about when dealing with this text is actually really, really not exclusive to those Christian scholars in the field. Indeed, many of the secular scholars that we love and are friends with also have this reverence or reluctance to sometimes engage with this stuff. So again, it's nothing to do with the background of the person. It's all to do with the way they approach the text and the way that they want to engage with it in a rigorous manner, I think.
Yeah.
And what has been said about let's say the impact our own personal positions has on what we see and what we read and how we interpret it is without doubt there. I've written a book, How to Write Early Christian History, in 2019 for COP, where I try to make a claim that scholarship is never neutral, is never objective. People who claim objectivity, and I've just read today a study of Plato, right, where objectivity is still being claimed, yeah, and where one attempts to read Plato in an analytical and hermeneutic way, so that one can read what one sees in front of it. I think that's futile. Nobody sees what he reads in front of it. We all read ourselves, first of all, into what we see. We only know what we know, unfortunately. And if you don't know Greek, you can't. But if you know Greek, you read Greek from your Christian perspective, if you read those Greek texts, if you're a Christian. And if you're a scholar, you read what you have been trained with. So there's no benefit from person A to person B. What I'm trying to say in this book of 2019 is the beauty in scholarship is that, and that applies to the believer and to the non-believer. The beauty is that the first attempt is always to prove yourself wrong. I mean, probably that's harder for a believer, because a believer doesn't want to prove her or himself wrong, because you don't want to eject yourself from the position where you're in. Yeah, I mean, if you're a Latin Mass Catholic, you don't want to go to the Protestants next Sunday. Yeah, or you don't want to become the atheist who doesn't go any longer to the Latin Mass. So you try to reconfirm your position, which is fair. I mean, that's what nature does. Although the scholars. But the attempt of scholarship is not to find proofs for your position, but to find the obstacles of your position. And only if you cannot find obstacles, you might hold to your position. Now, that's not intellectualism, but it is the attempt of becoming authentic as much as you can, and to remove as many glasses. Now I can't see you, so it's my perception. I only can see you when I have my glasses on, which shows, yeah, the glasses tell me how I think you are, and my glasses tell me what I think the texts are. And if I've been trained for 20, 30, 60 years in Latin Mass Catholicism, I will read those texts first of all from this tradition. If I'm a Protestant, I will read those texts from this position. Now, if you ask me a believer or an atheist, they're in the same boat. The one sits in the front, the other in the end, whoever wants to position them, but they're all rowing their own thing. And it's so hard, yeah, not to hit the iceberg if you're not trying to see the obstacle, but you have to see the obstacle. Otherwise, you drown together.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully,
Yeah, I was going to add that the way I think about it is disciplined listening. What we're trying to do here is recover ancient voices, ancient strata, ancient texts, and it just takes disciplined but also shared listening, where it can't just be my idiosyncratic take on this text. And that's where iron sharpens iron, or scholarship sharpens scholarship, because if we coming from different perspectives observe the same thing, and this, I think it's also important to branch out, to look at other sources, to read Stoic philosophy, to read Aesop's fables, to read Homer and Virgil and Plato. And the more well-read we are, the more careful and nuanced we can be with our similarities and differences, with our comparisons and our contrasts. And I think it's through just an ever refining process of comparison and contrast, of listening, of detecting, of filtering. But I think that's this is exciting. To me, it's like we're doing some really cutting edge stuff here in scholarship, but we're doing it together. And it's a meticulous, difficult. It takes years and years. I mean, Marcus, every week you're sending new updates with new findings, right? You've been working on this for years and years, and I'm feeling the same way. And that's, I think, why our for me, like, the method has to change. And that's why I feel like I've done so much good work, and I know it's good work, and that's why I have to upload it and share it, because I don't want it to just all go to waste. But I also don't want to wait. Klinghardt worked on this stuff for 10 years before publishing his tomes. So this is extremely complicated, and it reminds me of what Yuval Noah Harari just has a book on coming, that just came out, called Nexus, about human intelligence and networks. And he says, truth is difficult, it's complicated, and it takes a lot of work, and it's not usually rewarded, and it's costly. So a lot of us, a lot of our time, Marcus and me, it's really just been our leisure time that we've been doing this stuff. And we've had the luxury and leisure to have time to work on this, because there's very little academic incentives for doing this work. And that's both a self-reflection, but it's also it's a call for things to change. If New Testament studies and early Christian studies is really going to be about the pursuit of truth, then these kinds of projects should be very well funded, and we should be having dozens and dozens of scholars working on this. This should not be a lonely project. But right now, we're just going to have to be the cool kids. That's how it's going to have to be.
Well, the cool kids or the Three Stooges, I don't know which, but either way, I hope that we are steering you clear of the iceberg on this safe ship as three helmsmen. Thank you so much, Patristica viewers, yet again, for joining us in this conversation. Just another reminder, please do like and subscribe, and look out next Saturday for another video at 6 p.m. on perhaps our religious views or something else, who knows. But for now, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.